Welcome to Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of Web3 security, compliance, and risk. Join Michael Pearl as he interviews executives from across the Web3 industry to uncover the challenges and opportunities of this rapidly evolving space. Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that focuses on security, compliance, risk, fraud prevention, and everything that helps to keep Web3 safe. And today we have with us Chris Groshong. Chris is the president of Constructive, a Bitcoin and blockchain consulting and education company. And he's an executive director at Crypto Recovery Alliance. Chris has many different activities that he's involved in. He's also an expert witness in some of the more interesting cases, and we'll dive into that in a second. But Chris, did I miss anything?
No, for the crypto space, no,
But
that's
actually,
that's pretty spot on.
I don't know how many people know that, but actually your background is in genetics, right?
Yeah. I worked in the biotech and pharma industry for 15 plus years and have a bachelor's in genetics because it was exciting and I thought it would be the future of medicine. So I spent the better part of 2 decades in the pharma industry only to really feel like it kind of ripped the soul right out of me. It's not the most fun industry to be in, that's for sure. There's a lot of things that they don't teach you about the industry that you go into when you're studying it in college.
Yeah,
So what I mean is the lobbying and just the politics and the bureaucracy of big pharma. It was not a place that I wanted to be anymore.
Yeah, I guess it's not a pleasant place to be. But anyways, how did you get from that into the world of crypto and especially crypto compliance and fraud and so on?
Yeah, so it is kind of I'll try to make it as quick as possible for the listeners. But basically, right, because that's the thing. Everyone's like, well, how did you go from biotech to fintech? Because, if you're not a developer, right, well, how did you cross over? Well, part of it was timing. I think I got lucky that the timing was right, meaning in 2014, 2015, it was still early times. And there wasn't really this competitive advantage, I don't think, to anybody starting around that period who was new. So for me, I was just treating it like figuring out like what's going on, spending as much time as possible to figure out an angle to get in, because I knew it was the future, right? As soon as I learned you couldn't turn Bitcoin off, I was like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. That means innovation will spur around it. There's no way that it can't, right? I mean, that's what happened with the internet. You can't turn off the internet and look, everything around it just bloomed and blossomed, right? So that was the theory that I was going with. So I figured if I just put in all of my extra free time, so nights, weekends, I took vacation and I would go to conferences, right? I was just meeting people. I was just trying to absorb as much as I could. And up until about 2016, it was pretty easy for a single individual to kind of handle and stay up on like the entire space. There was only a few media outlets and sources, and then after 2016, it just got so big and everything started to get specialized, and all the suits started showing up to conferences that you could tell something was changing in the industry. In 2017, so how I first started, I was consulting. I was just trying to do general education and just trying to figure out a way to get my foot in the door. In 2017, I started a Bitcoin ATM company with a couple of folks, and I became the compliance officer. So that's how I got into compliance. And the only reason I took that position was because I knew other people in the industry who were already doing that work, who I could lean on as resources so that I wasn't completely left in the dark. Fast forward a year or so, that company wasn't going, and the partners that I was working with, or things were not going the direction that I wanted. And I could kind of see the writing on the wall, so I decided to leave. And about a year after that is when I started offering fractional compliance services. But in the meantime, I was offering also continuing education for banking compliance professionals, law enforcement, and attorneys, because I knew that those people specifically were going to have a tie and were going to come across crypto, and they really needed continuing education credits anyway, so it felt like a good fit. I still couldn't get anybody to take the course. I even had a course certified with the state of California to train law enforcement, and it was free, and I couldn't get people to show up. But because of that course that I built for law enforcement, I got a good reputation, or I got a good partnership with a company called CipherTrace, which is no longer in business. They were purchased by MasterCard, and then they went out, then they shut down that department. But at the time, I was using their tools to train law enforcement, and then they had a program where they were kind of using volunteers to help do some of the forensic work for these victims, and they started referring victims to me directly. And this was before I didn't even have a plan or a business to help victims. And after the first one, I said, you know what, maybe there is something we can do. Because at the end of the day, people really just want to know, like, what happened to their crypto? Like, where did it go? What actually happened to it? And like, how did I get duped into this whole thing in the first place? So the investigations came about pretty organically, to be honest. And the next thing I knew, I was like, well, let me just see if I can tell somebody what actually happened to their crypto, and then
What year
we'll
was
go
that?
from there. That was right as the pandemic was getting started, so end of 2019 going into 2020. So while everybody was like freaking
So
out and losing their jobs, I was like starting up this new path.
not only that, people got tons of money from the government and they ran to, Robinhood and all the rest to spend it, right? To invest it. But I'm just curious, what kind of tools did you have back then to actually run those investigations and forensics?
We had a couple different tools, and we still have a couple different tools now. The important thing about the blockchain forensics tools is honestly is to not rely on just one. Because if you're relying on one set of data, all these blockchain forensics companies, the real difference between all of them is mostly their attribution data, right? Because they all pretty much like systematically go from one hop to the next, and like they all have visualizations. The data is pretty easy to understand and use. Really, it's about how do you know that the address you're looking at really belongs to Binance or Gemini or OKX, right? Or how do you know that the wallet you're looking for belongs to an exchange at all of any kind, or a mixing service or something, right? So some of the tools that we had used in the past, we would get contacted by law enforcement down the line after we give the report back to the victim, and then the victim goes to works with law enforcement. And law enforcement will come back to us and say, hey, you blew right through what was a mixer. And our tool just didn't have the ability to recognize that. So we followed the wrong path, right? So, and that was based on the tools we were using. So that was the point where I realized, okay, we need to get a couple other tools so we can cross-reference, right? It's like, don't just take one source as the truth. Double check, cross-reference, and
Yeah.
that way you get a better set of data and more accurate, and that really is what helps the victim and law enforcement do their job better.
So I'm curious, can you run us through a typical case of, let's say, investigation, recovery, and eventually getting the funds back to the victim? What's kind of the value chain of that? How do you identify, who's the perpetrator? I understand that it's a lot of, practical complexities, but maybe like from a bird's eye view, what's the process in this?
Yeah, sure. We should probably caveat a little bit too about like recovery in general, but we'll go right into the process first. So victims usually come to us directly through referrals or whatever, and then on the website there's a survey, so that people can enter in some of that upfront information. And then if they qualify, usually it's for victims who've lost 10K or more, just because we know that people are less likely to actually want to pay for services if they've lost less than 10K. And so once they've qualified in the survey, then they get a link to book a free consultation appointment with one of our intake counselors. And so what that does is it really just, it sits them down and it sets the stage for them to understand what the process is. How does it work? Right? Because, everybody realizes now that there's a bunch of recovery scams out there, and I know we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But, this is so new, right, for people. Like people are very trusting. That's the one thing that I've really learned about doing this work, is that people are very trusting. So when they go to a recovery company for help or a blockchain forensics company and looking for help, they're most likely just going to trust whatever they say. Right? And then it really just comes down to how much is it going to cost to do the thing that this company is saying, and whether or not they feel like they can afford it and it's worth it to them. So a lot of these recovery companies overpromise and then underdeliver and charge a lot of money. Right? So what we would do is we break our investigations up into 2 stages. So once this person has gone through this kind of intake call, then they can decide, yes, I want to move forward with what's called the initial analysis. That's when they provide all of the transaction data, right? And then what we start to do is we start to determine what happened to the flow of funds. So first transaction, and you start looking at it and you start hopping forward and you start to see where it goes. What is it doing? And you do that with all of the transactions, and then you build a report, right? So, well, first off, you do that first stage of the initial analysis because the way I like to look at investigations, which the analogy I like to use is car repair, right? Because people who own cars know that, like, if it's leaking or making some noise, you have to take it down to the mechanic, right? And you take it to the mechanic. Now, if the mechanic looked at the outside of the car only and said, oh yeah, that leak, it looks like it's probably the transmission, it's going to be $6,000-$7,000 to replace your transmission, you would be like, wait a minute, hold on a second. I'm going to go to another mechanic and get a second opinion. The guy didn't even look under the hood. How does he know what the problem actually is, right? So in crypto, though, people aren't doing that. They're not going and getting a second opinion. They're just like, okay, first guy, great, you can do it. Okay, here's the money, go do it. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know how the process works. And so when you don't know enough, it's really easy to get tricked, duped, right? Scanned a second time. And so after that first stage, we're able to come back to people and we tell them, there's 3 different outcomes that can come out of this. It's what we call the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because your money could go to some place like a mixer, a tumbler, and it's going to be really hard for us to trace after the fact, right? So we usually say that's the ugly. That's like your worst case scenario, untraceable funds. The bad is not necessarily bad, but it's not as good as good, right? Which means there could be things like the money went to a foreign exchange, which is not going to be, it's in a jurisdiction that's not cooperative with the United States. They're not going to respond to law enforcement from the United States requests. So you're kind of like SOL at that point.
Isn't this the case in most of the investigations? Because at the end of the day, you have to be a very stupid scammer to dupe someone and to leave the money in, US or even like Western European jurisdiction.
Yeah, I mean, it is getting more. Yes, the scammers are getting smarter, and they do realize how people are finding the money and what they're doing. So yeah, they're getting smarter. They're using a lot more techniques to obfuscate the movement, right? And yes, it does get very difficult to get the money or find the assets in a place where they are recoverable. And just to be honest with people, like, we tell people up front, like, your chances of recovery are 5% or less usually, right? And that's, if you don't get something back in the first 6 months, it's likely going to be, like 2 to 3 years, if anything at all, because that's just the speed at which law enforcement moves. Like, even if they find the funds, we have several people who are waiting for their funds to be returned. It's just, there's not much that there's not much a citizen can do to like speed up the process. So the money is literally sitting with the U.S. Marshals. They've received letters saying that their funds have been seized, and they're waiting. And it's been like a year, and they haven't given them their money back. I don't know why it's taking so long.
Maybe I can contribute to that. We have worked with a huge law enforcement agency in one of the Western countries, and one of the things that we saw is that the process of investigation. First of all, as you said, people are not going to go to a recovery service if they lost something below 10K. So imagine that even if they go to the law enforcement directly, if it's below 50K, it won't even be handled, because at the end of the day, it's just a game of numbers. So let's say you're lucky or unlucky to be losing like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then they start investigating it. And then for people that want to further understand it, they can read one of the court rulings on Binance. I don't remember exactly which one, of a person, I think from Texas, that was scammed, and they sued Binance. And then what you can see there is the process through which the law enforcement agency is going to get the information, even before they actually file the court complaint and so on. So it's a very lengthy process, super costly for the government, right? So I can totally understand why it's taking so long. Why is there a bottleneck? But that's just my remark on that one.
Yeah, I mean, even lawyers who are actually doing similar work as law enforcement because they move faster than law enforcement. So, there's things that lawyers are doing, little tricks like using a John Doe as instead of an actual person in the name of the court docs, because then they can proceed with doing things like discovery and subpoenaing for data. They can contact a Bitcoin ATM company, they can contact an exchange, they can request information, and then they can get that data back, and then they can trace more. Because like the problem with the scammers is the scammers know that like if they go into an exchange, it's a black box. So meaning the example of like you take you have 10 $100 bills, you go to the bank and you make a deposit of $1,000, you come back a week later, you ask for $1,000 withdrawal, you get 50 $20 bills. You don't get the same $100 bills, right? Like no one expects that in their right mind. That's how the exchanges work. You deposit your crypto, they move it into like a consolidation wallet. It's theirs now. They do whatever they want. If people need to withdraw, they use that as withdrawal. So you can't follow the blockchain data as it goes into an exchange. As soon as you see it hit an exchange, you got to stop.
But
if you follow it through an exchange, then you're following somebody else's money. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally get it. But here it begs the question. So let's say you trace the money, right? And you finally identify that this wallet belongs to an exchange, a centralized exchange. So I totally understand that once the money was deposited to the deposit address, you cannot really trace who it went to unless you go to the interface of the exchange and so on. But at this point, isn't the exchange liable for the funds that they're receiving? Shouldn't they run any screen checks on the funds that they're receiving to check that it's not funds that originated from a hack or from a mixer and so on?
Yeah, and a lot of them do, but you got to remember that the scammers are also getting more sophisticated. So they're moving, like it's very difficult for an exchange or a crypto financial institution to look really far back on the blockchain to really determine how far back you need to go. And if you go back 3 hops and you don't see anything, if you go back 5 hops and you don't see anything, then how do you know? I mean, how far do you go back, right? This is always the question. Banks don't even do that. So the crypto industry is doing, in some cases, even more than banks are, but they're still getting in trouble. They're still being told, like, you're not doing enough. So, I mean, it's kind of funny.
I think it's a very good point, because the thing is, I think that nowadays, with all the complexity and the speed of things and, the different DeFi protocols that you have, I think going back 2-3 hops is not sufficient. Right? So you need to go, I mean, in some cases we go 20 hops backwards, and again, we do it automatically, so it's much easier. But only then is when you identify that the money, went through some suspicious DAX and then went off to a different wallet and so on, or that the money went through a mixer and so on. So 2-3 hops, maybe it covers you, right, from the regulatory standpoint, not always, but it's definitely not sufficient for being compliant.
Well, I would say it is sufficient for being compliant to the letter of the law, right? But this is the hard part about compliance, because we also do, right? Because I'm also a fractional compliance officer, and I know you guys do compliance stuff, like, and so your audience is very familiar with compliance and how it operates, right? But it's like security, right? You can always do more on your security side. You could probably always do more on your compliance side, but then this is why compliance is a science and an art, right? Because you need to prevent as much risk as possible, right? But you don't want to hinder your operation. So there's always this balance of and especially like when we come into work with a new company on the compliance side, usually we work with early stage entities, right, who don't need full-time compliance. They just need part-time compliance, and they don't know what they're doing, and they don't want to get in trouble. So, but before that, the CEO has been the compliance officer for like 6 months or whatever. And that's a real conflict of interest, because the CEO is trying to grow the business, get more customers. The compliance officer is looking for bad things and kicking people out of the system. It's like the exact opposite of what the CEO is trying to do. So a lot of times those two positions are at odds with each other about the direction of how the business is supposed to go. And so that's why it's important to have the separation of those powers, because then you actually get balance.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just to give you one example, and I'm not going to name names, but we worked with a very large crypto exchange, centralized exchange, and we actually found, I think, a few tens of millions of dollars that was stolen from their clients in a pig butchering scams, in various pig butchering scams, right? It wasn't one, it was a period of time where, microtransactions and so on, the drill. And eventually, their compliance manager told me, listen, I'm going to get in trouble because if we drop all this volume, then the exchange is going to suffer. So it's a very good point that they need to balance between the business objectives and the compliance objectives, and hope that the compliance objectives won't come back to haunt them.
Yeah, right. And you don't know that until you get audited, right?
Exactly.
And so a lot of times they're relying on us, and they're keeping their fingers crossed that so when they do come knocking on the door and they do start looking around at all the data, that they're not going to find anything major, right? And that's really the point of the whole thing, right? Is avoid anything major. Little things, sure, you can tweak and change stuff, right, on your policies and procedures on the compliance side to make your business stronger. But some of those things, like, you may not want to do too much up front. It's like incremental steps. It's like what they in science, right? You don't want to change too many variables at once, because then you don't know which one is responsible for the outcome. So you kind of need to do like one incremental change, another incremental change, and another one, and wait to see in between how that affects your business. Rather than taking a bunch of okay, we need to do these 3 things right now and implement, and right, unless you're being told by a regulatory agency that you need to do X, Y, and Z right now, right? You kind of want to take these smaller steps in between, so you can determine how your business is being affected as you do. We lost you, Mike.
In my humble opinion, the best practice is to let the compliance manager know all the information, right? So they can have all the information about, the illicit funds, the fraudulent transactions, and so on. And then they can decide what they want to do with it, right? So at the end of the day, they can set the barrier and they can automatically change it in their interface to, how severe they want to go about it. But not knowing is going to get you in trouble, because at the end of the day, as you said, when the auditor comes, then you need to have the proper information and to show that you're in control.
Yeah, and the great thing about doing both compliance work and investigation work is they really go hand in hand, right? Because as you know, part of compliance's job is to investigate suspicious activity. Or suspicious transactions. So when and the great thing about doing those works separately, right? Like having a whole investigation department excuse me, is that the victims, when they come to you on investigations, they tell you everything because they want help. So they're not like holding back, right? Which makes it easier to spot illicit activity when you're doing compliance work, because those people don't tell you anything. And if anything, they lie about what their intentions are or how they're doing things or why they're doing what they're doing. And so if you have this information and you can see these patterns from these other victims that have been telling you things, and then you talk to somebody or you see patterns in the compliance side of things, you can make those connections and say, this looks very similar to what this other victim told me. This person is likely being scammed. Even they won't admit to it, or they won't give us enough information to let us know. It's like we can tell without them telling us, right? So, and that's only because we've been able to get the other side of the story already ahead of time, right? So then it helps us ask better questions, right? To get to the answers that we need, so that because a lot of times if you ask the right question to a victim on the phone, in the compliance situation, it's like a light bulb goes off, and then they start to open up, and they start to realize, like, wait, how did you know that was something that this guy was going to say or do? Well, it's because they do it to everybody, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not new. You're not in a special situation. This is happening to hundreds, thousands of people.
And there's a playbook.
Yeah, there's a script, there's a playbook. They're coaching you. Like, how do I know what they're going to say next? Because that's what they do to everybody, right? It's for them, they're operating their scams just like a business. They're running them exactly like a business. It's a full-on business operation. Just imagine if those people would spend a fraction of their time doing something good rather than scamming people, how much better the world would actually be, right?
For sure, for sure. And I think it's actually a good segue for me to ask you the question of give me the juicy story, right? So you're working with quite a few victims, and you have uncovered quite a few scams and frauds and so on. Can you give me some specific examples, some figures, some heartbreaking stories?
I'll give you one that's kind of controversial, and it was actually it was fun to work because it actually led us to a person. A lot of times the funds don't lead us to an actual individual because they hit an exchange, right? Things like that. And you would say, well, if it hits an exchange, then somebody had an account. And in the early days, you used to be able to just go to the exchange and figure out who the account holder was, and that was probably right another lead of some bad guy who opened the account. But now, because the scams are getting so sophisticated, they're acting like fake exchanges, and they're actually doing KYC on people. So they're asking you to like take a selfie with your ID. Now, as soon as you do that, they can take that picture, crop it. They got a picture of your head, and they got a picture of your ID. That's all they need to go to another exchange and set up an account for you. So they take your picture, and they can use AI tools that are built to test KYC tools. So as a developer, I can download this free tool. I can map an image to my face so I can test the liveness check.
Yeah.
Right?
Amazing.
And now I have a picture of the ID, and the selfie, which is exactly what the exchanges are asking for. So now the bad guys are using real people's identities to go set up accounts on other exchanges. So when law enforcement goes and asks OKX or Binance or some overseas exchange who had this account where the illicit funds flowed, they'll be like, oh, it's this 74-year-old grandma from Illinois. And you're like, I'm pretty sure she's not the mastermind behind this thing, and likely not involved at all. In fact, she's another victim, right? So it gets really kind of crazy sometimes. Okay, so to the story, the story that we worked, it was a victim who was living in the United States from Canada, and he wasn't exactly sure how his funds got drained, and so we just started looking at the data. We just started following the data. And it wasn't a very complex trace. But like 3 hops in, we noticed a wallet that sent money to like FTX. And that wallet still had quite a bit of funds in it. And in this wallet, there was an NFT that was an ENS. And so for those of you who don't know what ENSs are, those are Ethereum naming service, which is just like a DNS. So instead of typing in the numbers for a website, right? You type in a word or words, right? Same thing, instead of 0x something in a long string of characters for your Ethereum address, you can type like chris.eth. And that would be the same thing. It like replaces your address. So this ENS was actually a very controversial ENS. It's the N word,
Oh,
.eth, right? And so the first thing, all these alarms are going off in my head, like, oh my goodness, like this has to be being talked about, right? Like whoever created this, like this has got to be, people have got to be talking about. And where do people talk about crypto stuff a lot? Twitter, right? So we went to X, Twitter, whatever, and we started digging around and just looking for comments. And so we started doing all this OSINT, open source intelligence. And we were able to find multiple accounts associated not only with this term, but also listed on the ENS itself. And the ENS listed a Twitter handle was a 2-letter Twitter handle, which means you had to be on Twitter like early days, like the first
yeah.
couple of months, right? Like the first week, maybe even, to get a 2-letter Twitter handle. Now, all those tweets are private now, but there's this tool called the Wayback Machine. And if you haven't heard about it, it's basically
Yeah.
an internet archive. So you can go up and you can, it's really used in 2 ways. One is to go look at old snapshots of websites, or if you want, you can use it to snapshot a website right now, right? So that way, like, even if it changes or if it disappears. So one of the things I tell victims is, if the site is still up, go log it in, right? At the Internet Archive, like the Wayback Machine, so that there's a copy for all time, and you can do any page, all the pages, the home page, or whatever you want, but like try to get it in there so that it's stored, right?
Mhm.
And so from this, we were able to see all these old tweets, like going back years and years and years. And in there were things like phone numbers and a physical address, right? Like having a garage sale, because in the early days of Twitter, people were just using it like open public DMs, right? And hey, let's meet for coffee. Here's my phone number. And then I took the phone number and we looked it up, and it was tied to a business, right? And so now we have a location, we have a business, and then from there we just kind of like stepped forward and we found more Twitter accounts that were connected to the other Twitter accounts. And so we built this whole profile up of this individual, and we're able to tell that all of this stuff is connected, right? And so it turned out that the scammer was, or the person connected to the scam, was living in Canada. And so the victim living in the U.S. was Canadian also, still a citizen, right? But instead of now sending it to U.S. law enforcement, we decided, hey, just you, the victim, go back, contact law enforcement in Canada, and keep the whole thing in Canada, because it'll go a lot faster. So he calls the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is kind of like the FBI in the U.S. And
Yeah.
they put him on hold, and they called the victim, or they called the suspect. So they got him on hold, and now they're talking to the suspect, and they're telling the suspect, hey, someone has complained about you potentially being involved in illegal stuff, but we know you're not a bad guy because you've applied to a government job and submitted a bunch of information to us, and blah, 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 blah. And then they go back to the victim and they say, yeah, this guy couldn't possibly be the bad guy because he's applied for a government job and la 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 la, this, that, and the other thing. And I've never heard of anybody, regardless of whether they think that the guy is innocent or not, I've never heard of law enforcement calling up a suspect and then telling them that they're being investigated.
Amazing.
It blew my mind. I was like, how is that even? I don't think that's even legal. So regardless, and there was over 1,000 ETH sitting in the wallet. So at the time, this was several years ago, I think it was valued. ETH was maybe like $1,200. So there was like $1.3 million of value and sitting in this wallet. Within 12 hours, the money started moving. So like 50 ETH went into Tornado Cash, and this was like a week before it got sanctioned and shut down. And then like 500 ETH moved out right away. And I was like, this is obvious. This is so obvious that you were actually talking to the right guy, to the scammer, because how else would they have known to start moving the money,
Yeah. But
right?
let me ask you at this point, if
Yeah,
I'm guessing it's like a non-custodial wallet, let's say a MetaMask or something like that, right? It's not an exchange-based wallet.
correct.
So what can you actually do? Let's say he would have left the money there. You can't really touch the money, right?
Mm-mm.
You can't really get a hold of that fund, of those
No,
funds.
but we have in our tracing tools, we have the ability to put on a watch of that address so that we can tell if it ever moves. So basically, all we have to do is we can wait as long as the scammers can wait. So if it moves, then we let the victim and law enforcement know. But the interesting thing about this situation was we said, okay, look, obviously RCMP like totally screwed this whole thing up, and I'm sure this is not a reflection on the whole RCMP, right? This was just a poorly handled situation by one individual. Maybe they were new, maybe they weren't trained properly. Regardless of whatever the situation was, it made it worse. And so I said, well, look, we better just contact law enforcement in the United States. You're here in the U.S. Maybe we'll get a better outcome. So we did. We reached out to U.S. law enforcement, I believe it was Secret Service, and come to find out, they had a suspect in custody, a different suspect in custody, and they had seized a bunch of assets already. The problem was they didn't know that these people were also involved in crypto. So they didn't know any of the crypto stuff. They only had a bunch of traditional financial stuff. So wires and banks and a bunch of other money laundering stuff. So it took them like a year basically to go back and then add up all these other charges and then arraign these guys. So I keep in touch with the victim because a lot of times law enforcement won't directly relay the information to us, even though we're representing the client. They'll only want to tell the client directly or the victim directly. So in this situation, the victim, checks in with us every couple months. And the last thing I heard was, hey, I'm supposed to be getting my money back. And I'm, really thankful for all the work that you guys did and help. And I just, I don't know when I'm going to get it back. Right. And so that's the biggest problem is that the money's there, but they don't necessarily give it back to you right away either. So
Yeah.
it's not an efficient process. I'll tell you that.
Even though if they move it to, let's say, Coinbase, then you can catch it immediately, right? You can ask to freeze the funds and you can get a hold of those funds.
Yeah. And there's some preventative things you can do too. Like you can report the wallet addresses to things like chain abuse. There's a new tool out there, product on the market called Verify Wallet, which as an individual, if you're not sure about, if you got this gut feeling that says, I don't know if this thing that I'm getting into is right, you can put in the wallet address of the place that you're supposed to be sending the funds to and see if it comes up in Verify Wallet associated with any other scams.
Yeah.
And that's one way as an individual you can check for yourself to see. And now and then it's not always going to come up because a lot of times they use new wallets. But due to clustering, a lot of times they can actually tell, like, oh, this wallet does belong to all these other wallets. And it's likely that this is also a scam. And then they'll let you know, and then you can avoid it. So that's a really powerful new tool that's on the market.
I can attest to that, if your wallet is on either of those tools that you've mentioned, which are super important, right? But
Yeah.
if the wallet was reported, most chances are that this wallet is no longer active as an actual fraud wallet. So the problem is that the majority of those wallets, and again, it's super easy to create a new wallet and for it to be squeaky clean and nobody knows the affiliation, right? So that's the biggest challenge right now. And again, I totally agree with you that people should do their own, research and check those wallets. But probably the most efficient way is to prevent at the centralized entity level the users from sending funds to those wallets. And that's something that we see every day working with centralized exchanges and on and off ramps. People are oblivious, and usually if you run those wallets through any other intelligence tracing and so on service, they come out clean because for the most of it they had like one transaction. By the way, if they have zero transaction, they're suspicious, right? But 1, 2, 3 transactions, they look super clean. But then again, we, again, as you said, with clustering and with other AI methods, eventually we figure out that, hey, they are affiliated with a big butchering network or, address poisoning and things of that sort.
Yeah, like we were saying earlier, right? They're getting a lot more sophisticated. We're seeing, so back to some of the earlier stuff, we're seeing a lot of the funds being bridged now. So typical patterns are 1, 2, 3 hops, bridge. So they're bridging a lot of the funds to Tron, and then they're doing like almost it feels like they're using a bot or something because there's hundreds of transactions after that. They break them up into small pieces. They could be paying them. They could be paying their staff, the scam staff. They could be giving withdrawals to other people, which is a technique, right, that the scammers use to make you feel like, to give you some confidence in the platform. So before, they never used to let victims do that. It was just try to get as much out of them to get them to deposit as they can. Now they realize if they get you to deposit 5 or 10 grand, and then they give you back 5 grand or 10 grand, then you'll come back with 100, 200K, or the big fish will, and they'll push it all in. And so the scammers have just realized that the psychology around how actually people think, a lot of it is just human psychology. It just feels like they're just taking advantage of people and how people normally operate.
Yeah, that playbook that we talked about, it comes in handy, right? Yeah. And actually, if you look at some of those cases, you see that they are able to recruit and to train people in 0 time. And these people are actually super efficient. So again, as you said, if they would invest all this time and knowledge and talent into positive things, maybe the crypto space would be better off.
100%. 100%.
Chris, on that note, first of all, it was fascinating. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. But where can we read more about your super interesting work? Are you active on socials? Any interviews, panels? Where can we catch up with you?
Yeah, my team and I post a lot of things to Twitter and LinkedIn. So you can follow Constructive at all those main social channels. I'm on socials as well at DJ KINKLE. That's DJ Kinkle. That because I used to DJ in college. And I kept the name, and then I never thought Twitter would take off, so that's why my
Another
Twitter
fun
handle.
fact.
And then the last thing too, where you can get more information, and I know we didn't get a chance to really talk about it, is the Crypto Recovery Alliance, which is, and I don't know, it probably won't come out on the show, but the QR code on the shirt is for the link tree for the CRA, and the Crypto Recovery Alliance, just real quickly, is the nonprofit version of Constructive. And the reason I'm starting that, or have been working to start that, this nonprofit, is because there are so many victims who aren't getting the help that they need and can't afford private services like what Constructive offers. So I want to be able to give back to the community. I want to be able to help the victims who can't afford services, because those are the ones who really need it the most. So the mission of the CRA is 3 things. One is to provide no-cost blockchain forensics investigations for victims who qualify financially, so they can actually prove like financial hardship. And then the other 2 things for members are going to be available to everyone, which are access to low or no-cost mental health care services, right? So they can process being the victim and the trauma that's associated with going through that whole thing. Because a lot of times people think, oh, if I lose the money, if I can get it back, it's going to fix all my problems. But really, the ball has already been set in motion, right? If you were married, the trust has been broken. Like you took money out of a shared savings account, or you did something behind somebody's back without them knowing. Even if you're not cheating, it still feels like a violation of trust. And then all of these other things that just spiral down on top of it, right? So like you get like tunnel vision, and all you can think about is the money you lost. So then your performance at work goes down. You're not eating, you're not sleeping well, right? And it gets all the way to things like being suicidal, divorces. Like, I mean, your whole world gets flipped upside down, and the scammers they do not care. They have moved on to the next victim. So that's why the mental health part is such an important factor. And then lastly, it's the continuing, it's education so that people can avoid being scammed a second time. So this kind of understanding of how you're being targeted and what to look for. Because once you're scammed once, you get into the scam list, and then they treat you just like they do with retargeting for marketing, and they'll just keep coming at you. And if they can get more money out of you 3 years down the line, they don't care, right? Like, they know you're a target. So that's why I started the Crypto Recovery Alliance, to help the worst of the worst victims.
Listen, kudos on what you're doing with the Crypto Recovery Alliance.
Thank you.
Super interesting to hear about your work. Maybe we'll do a follow-up with some more juicy stories along the way. Chris, thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.